What if the avoidant who acted cold, distant, and completely unaffected by losing you actually cared more than you ever realized? Most people think avoidants move on instantly, but Carl Jung believed the emotions we bury never disappear. They grow stronger in the unconscious. And that's exactly why the more brutal the discard, the deeper the emotional impact becomes. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, and completely remove your presence, something shifts inside the avoidant mind that they can't easily escape. What looked like indifference can slowly turn into obsession, regret, anxiety, and emotional confusion. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden psychology behind why avoidants often react the strongest after the connection is gone, how Jung's shadow theory explains their behavior, and why your silence can affect them more than love ever did. By the end, you may completely rethink what not caring actually means. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidance is the belief that they simply do not care. When a relationship ends, they often appear calm, emotionally detached, or even relieved, while the other person is left devastated and confused. But what many people fail to understand is that avoidants are experts at suppressing emotion, not escaping it. This is where Carl Jung's ideas become incredibly powerful. Jung believed that the emotions, fears, and desires we push away do not disappear. They sink into the unconscious mind, where they continue to influence us in ways we barely recognize. For avoidants, intimacy itself can feel overwhelming because deep connection forces them to confront vulnerability, dependency, and emotional exposure, things they learn to associate with danger or loss of control. So during the relationship, they often survive emotionally by creating distance. They pull away, avoid difficult conversations, become inconsistent, or act emotionally numb because staying disconnected feels safer than fully opening up. But the real psychological shift happens after they lose you. The moment you stop chasing, stop reassuring, and completely remove your emotional presence, the avoidant no longer has anything distracting them from the feelings they buried. At first, they may feel freedom because the pressure of intimacy is gone, but over time that silence becomes louder than the relationship itself. Suddenly, the comfort they took for granted, the attention they always expected to be there, and the emotional safety you provided are no longer accessible. And because avoidants are often disconnected from their emotions in the moment, realization tends to arrive late. What they suppressed during the relationship starts resurfacing in the unconscious mind. This is why some avoidants begin obsessing over memories months later, replaying conversations, stalking social media, or feeling intense anxiety after acting completely unaffected at the breakup. Jung would describe this as the return of the shadow, the hidden emotional truth they refused to face while the relationship was active. The brutal discard becomes powerful because it destroys the illusion of emotional control. As long as they believed you would always remain emotionally available, they could maintain distance without consequence. But once they truly feel your absence, their internal defenses begin cracking. The avoidant mind is often more disturbed by emotional unavailability than emotional conflict, because conflict still keeps the connection alive. Silence forces confrontation with loss. And what makes this even more painful for avoidants is that they are usually not equipped to process grief in healthy ways. Instead of openly expressing regret or sadness, they may distract themselves, jump into new connections, overwork, or pretend nothing matters. Yet deep down, the unresolved emotions continue building pressure beneath the surface. This is why people are often shocked when an avoidant suddenly returns after weeks or months of distance. It is not always manipulation or a game. Sometimes it is the delayed collapse of emotional suppression finally catching up to them. The more complete and final your absence feels, the harder it becomes for them to escape what they truly feel. One of the most confusing things about avoidance is how convincing their emotional detachment can seem. They can walk away from deep connections appearing calm, unaffected, and emotionally distant, leaving the other person wondering if any of it was ever real in the first place. But in many cases, that cold behavior is not proof that they never cared. It is a defense mechanism designed to protect them from emotions they do not know how to handle. Carl Jung believed that the human mind creates psychological defenses to avoid confronting painful truths hidden in the unconscious. For avoidants, vulnerability itself often feels unsafe because somewhere in their past, emotional closeness became connected to rejection, disappointment, criticism, or loss of independence. As a result, they learn to survive relationships by suppressing emotional needs instead of expressing them openly. Over time, this emotional suppression becomes so automatic that even they may believe they are unaffected. That is why avoidants often wear the "I don't care" mask so naturally. It gives them a sense of control. If they act detached, they never have to fully admit how deeply someone affects them. They avoid difficult conversations, minimize emotional moments, or suddenly withdraw when intimacy becomes too intense, because emotional exposure triggers anxiety they struggle to explain. To the outside world, it looks cold or cruel, but internally it is often fear disguised as indifference. The problem is that suppressed emotions do not disappear just because they are ignored. Jung warned that whatever remains buried in the unconscious gains power over us, and this becomes especially visible after a harsh or unexpected discard. When someone completely walks away from an avoidant, no chasing, no reassurance, no emotional access, it triggers the exact abandonment wound they work so hard to avoid feeling. Suddenly, the emotional distance that once protected them stops working. The person they assumed would remain available is gone, and that loss begins breaking through the emotional numbness they depended on. This is why the harsher the discard feels, the stronger the avoidant's internal reaction can become. It forces them into emotional territory they spent years avoiding. Their mind may begin replaying memories they ignored during the relationship. They may feel unexpected jealousy, anxiety, regret, or even panic, despite acting completely unaffected before. The reason this reaction often appears delayed is because avoidants process emotions differently. While emotionally expressive people feel pain immediately, avoidants tend to disconnect first and feel later, once the reality of the loss settles into the unconscious mind. And because they are uncomfortable with vulnerability, they rarely express this pain directly. Instead, it may come out through indirect behaviors, checking your social media, finding excuses to reconnect, suddenly acting nostalgic, or becoming emotionally reactive when they see you moving on. The "I don't care" persona begins cracking because the deeper attachment wound underneath has been activated. What looked like emotional strength was often emotional protection. Jung psychology helps explain why avoidants can seem emotionally numb on the surface while carrying intense unresolved emotions underneath. The mask exists to prevent pain, but the more powerful the connection was, the harder it becomes for that mask to hold once the person is truly gone. Silence affects avoidance in a way that often confuses people who assume they are simply unbothered or emotionally detached. On the surface, it may look like they handle distance easily, but in reality, silence removes the one thing their nervous system is quietly conditioned to manage: controlled emotional connection. In many avoidant patterns, conflict, arguments, or emotional intensity are still forms of connection, even if they feel uncomfortable in the moment. There is interaction, there is attention, there is a psychological thread still tying two people together. So even when things are tense, the relationship still exists in a recognizable form. But silence is different. Silence removes feedback, removes access, and removes emotional predictability. It creates a void where the avoidant can no longer control the distance or manage the intensity. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious helps explain why this feels so unsettling. When emotions are repeatedly avoided, they do not vanish. They are pushed deeper into the unconscious mind, where they remain active beneath awareness. This means that avoidants often live with unprocessed emotional material that they have learned to ignore rather than resolve. As long as there is some form of connection, even a negative one, those buried emotions remain contained within a structure they understand. But when silence enters, that structure collapses. Total emotional disappearance forces a confrontation with absence itself, and absence can feel far more threatening than conflict. Conflict still gives them something to react to, something to regulate, something to interpret. Silence offers nothing, and in that nothingness, uncomfortable feelings begin to surface without distraction. This is where emotional emptiness becomes noticeable. It is not just missing a person. It is the sudden awareness of internal disconnection that was previously hidden beneath the relationship dynamics. Many avoidants unconsciously rely on external emotional engagement to avoid sitting with their own unresolved feelings. When that external engagement disappears, they are left alone with thoughts and emotions they have spent years pushing away. This is why silence can slowly trigger anxiety, restlessness, or intrusive reflection long after the breakup or discard has occurred. It is also why avoidants may sometimes reach out after periods of no contact, not necessarily because they are ready for emotional vulnerability, but because the silence itself becomes psychologically difficult to maintain. Jung would describe this as the unconscious demanding attention, the repressed emotional reality pressing back into awareness. In contrast, arguments or emotional exchanges, even painful ones, still provide structure. They allow the avoidant to stay in a familiar pattern where emotions are externalized and controlled at a distance. Silence removes that safety net entirely. It does not force immediate emotional expression, but it creates a psychological space where avoidance becomes harder to sustain. Over time, that emptiness can amplify unresolved attachment wounds, making the absence feel heavier than the presence of conflict ever did. Carl Jung's idea of the shadow helps explain why someone who once seemed detached or emotionally unavailable can suddenly appear fixated after you've fully walked away. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not a separate entity, but a part of the psyche where we store everything we reject, suppress, or refuse to consciously acknowledge. Emotions, needs, fears, and even desires that don't fit the identity we try to maintain. For avoidant individuals, emotional dependency, longing, vulnerability, and attachment can all become qualities they unconsciously push into this hidden psychological space, because those feelings feel unsafe or overwhelming to face directly. During the relationship, they manage this by keeping distance, controlling emotional intensity, or mentally minimizing the depth of attachment. But when you simply remove yourself completely, something shifts in that internal structure. You are no longer available as a predictable emotional presence, yet you are also not fully gone from their psyche. Instead, you become unresolved material in their unconscious, something unfinished, unprocessed, and therefore psychologically active. This is where the shadow concept becomes particularly relevant. What cannot be integrated becomes charged, and what is charged tends to resurface indirectly through thoughts, dreams, emotional spikes, or obsessive reflection. It is not that the avoidant suddenly develops new feelings out of nowhere, but rather that existing feelings they did not fully process begin to return in fragmented ways. The mind struggles to reconcile the version of you that once felt familiar with the reality of your absence, and that tension creates internal pressure. Jung would describe this as projection and shadow activation, the psyche attempting to recover what it previously disowned. So when someone walks away decisively, without chasing or emotional reopening, they can unintentionally become more psychologically significant over time, not less. The absence leaves no new narrative for the mind to settle into, which means the emotional story remains open-ended. For avoidants, who already tend to avoid direct emotional processing, this unresolved ending can quietly intensify internal preoccupation. It may show up as sudden curiosity about your life, emotional restlessness, or an urge to reestablish contact long after they appeared indifferent. This is often misread as manipulation or games, but in Jungian terms, it is more accurately understood as the psyche trying to reclaim something it never fully integrated. The sudden obsession is not instant emotion appearing from nowhere. It is delayed confrontation with emotional material that was never consciously dealt with in the first place. Avoidance returning after acting completely detached is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in relationships, because from the outside it looks inconsistent or even confusing. But internally it often follows a very specific emotional pattern. During the relationship, avoidants tend to experience closeness as something that gradually increases psychological pressure. Even when they care, sustained intimacy can activate feelings of being overwhelmed, trapped, or emotionally exposed, so their natural response is to create distance as a way to regulate that discomfort. This is why they may seem present one moment and distant the next, or emotionally engaged but suddenly withdrawn when things become too intense. It is less about a lack of feeling and more about difficulty tolerating sustained emotional closeness. Over time, this creates a push-pull cycle where connection exists, but is repeatedly interrupted by withdrawal. However, what often gets overlooked is that distancing does not always resolve the underlying emotions. It simply removes the immediate pressure of intimacy. So during the relationship, avoidants are not fully processing their feelings. They are regulating them by stepping back. This is where the shift after separation becomes important. Once the relationship ends and the emotional intensity drops, the nervous system is no longer in a state of activation or defense. The absence of pressure can create a kind of psychological quiet space, where emotions that were previously suppressed or avoided begin to surface more clearly. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious helps explain this phenomenon. What is not consciously processed does not disappear. It simply moves out of awareness and can re-emerge later when conditions feel safer. In separation, there is no longer the immediate demand for emotional exposure, vulnerability, or relational responsibility, which means the avoidant mind may finally begin to reflect without feeling overwhelmed. In that quieter emotional state, they may start re-evaluating the relationship, remembering positive moments more vividly, or recognizing emotional significance that was previously pushed aside. This does not always mean sudden romantic realization in a dramatic sense, but rather a delayed integration of feelings that were not fully accessible during the relationship itself. Another important factor is that separation removes the dynamic that triggered their avoidance in the first place. Without the ongoing pressure of intimacy, the mind is free from the constant need to protect itself, which can make emotional connection feel safer in hindsight. This is why some avoidants appear more emotionally open, nostalgic, or even regretful after the relationship ends than they ever did during it. It is not necessarily that their feelings suddenly appear out of nowhere, but that the emotional environment has changed enough for those feelings to become tolerable to acknowledge. In some cases, this leads to reaching out, not always with a clear intention to restart the relationship, but to re-establish emotional familiarity or resolve internal discomfort created by unresolved attachment. Ultimately, the return is often less about strategy and more about timing, the point at which emotional distance finally makes reflection possible, and what was once overwhelming becomes something they can finally begin to feel. For many avoidants, emotional distance is not just a preference, it is a form of psychological control that helps them feel safe in relationships. By keeping a certain level of detachment, they can regulate intimacy on their own terms, deciding how close or how far they want to be at any given moment. This creates a sense of stability, because nothing ever feels too emotionally overwhelming or unpredictable. As long as they are the ones managing the distance, they maintain the illusion that they are in control of both themselves and the relationship. Even when they pull away, there is often an unspoken assumption that the connection still exists in the background and can be returned to when they feel ready. However, when you are the one who ultimately leaves, especially in a clear, decisive, or emotionally final way, that internal system is disrupted. The control they once believed they had over emotional closeness is suddenly no longer available. Instead of being the one who steps back and returns on their own terms, they are faced with the reality that the connection has ended outside of their control. This shift can be psychologically unsettling because it removes their ability to manage the emotional distance they once relied on for stability. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious can help explain this reaction more deeply. When people consistently avoid certain emotions, they build defenses that depend on predictability and control. Those defenses work as long as the environment follows familiar patterns: closeness, withdrawal, return, and emotional spacing that feels manageable. But a definitive discard disrupts that pattern entirely. It introduces finality, which is something avoidants often struggle with more than ongoing uncertainty. Instead of being able to regulate the relationship dynamically, they are forced into a position where the outcome is no longer in their hands. This can create an internal psychological imbalance because the structure they used to feel emotionally safe has collapsed. What was once a controlled environment of push and pull becomes a fixed absence they cannot easily influence. Over time, this can lead to cognitive dissonance, the mind trying to reconcile the belief that they were unaffected or in control with the reality that the connection ended without their participation. Even if they initially appear calm or indifferent, this disruption can surface later as reflection, curiosity, or a renewed focus on the person who left. The reason is not simply emotional loss, but the loss of control over emotional pacing. They are no longer able to regulate proximity, manage distance, or re-enter the connection on their own timing. That lack of control can make the situation linger in their mind longer than expected. In this way, the brutal discard does not just end the relationship. It challenges the internal system they relied on to feel emotionally secure. And when that system breaks, it often forces a kind of delayed psychological processing that they would not have entered while still feeling in control. One of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant behavior is the timeline of how emotional impact actually unfolds. Right after a breakup or discard, it can genuinely look like they feel nothing, or even relief. And in many cases, that relief is real, but it is not the full story. What they are often feeling in that moment is a drop in emotional pressure, not the absence of emotional attachment. When a relationship carries intensity, expectations, or vulnerability demands, an avoidant nervous system can experience it as internal tension. So when it ends, the first response is often a sense of space, calm, or emotional freedom because the immediate demand for closeness is gone. But this stage is usually temporary. Once the nervous system settles, something else begins to surface: the absence of emotional regulation that the relationship quietly provided. Emotional safety is not always recognized in the moment it exists. For avoidance especially, it is often experienced indirectly, through consistent communication, predictable reassurance, familiar presence, and a sense that someone is emotionally available, even if they are not actively engaging all the time. These things don't always register as need during the relationship, because avoidance pushes attention away from dependency. But once the connection is gone, the brain starts to register what is missing. Carl Jung's framework helps explain this delayed realization through the idea that what is not consciously acknowledged does not disappear. It remains active in the unconscious and re-emerges when the mind is no longer occupied with defense. In this case, the defense is emotional distancing. During the relationship, distance helps them avoid fully processing how much stability the connection actually provides. After separation, that defense is no longer needed, and the emotional system begins to recalibrate. This is where the contrast becomes more noticeable. Daily life continues, but the subtle forms of emotional grounding that were once present are gone. No familiar person to turn to, no predictable emotional feedback, no passive sense of connection in the background. It is not always dramatic sadness at first. Instead, it can show up as restlessness, intrusive thoughts, or a quiet sense that something stabilizing is missing. Over time, this absence can become more emotionally significant than the initial relief. What they begin to miss is not just the person, but the regulation that came with them, the way the relationship helped soften emotional fluctuations, even if they were not consciously aware of it at the time. This is why avoidants may seem indifferent early on, but later become reflective, nostalgic, or unexpectedly curious about reconnecting. The mind slowly reprocesses what was previously filtered out by avoidance. Emotional safety, once removed, becomes more visible in hindsight than it ever was in presence. Avoidants are often misunderstood as people who fear rejection above all else, but in many cases, what they struggle with even more deeply is the feeling of dependency itself. Dependency requires emotional openness, and emotional openness requires a level of vulnerability that can feel threatening to someone who has learned to equate closeness with loss of control. So, rather than leaning into attachment, avoidants tend to regulate their emotional world by keeping a safe distance, where they feel self-contained and less exposed to potential overwhelm. This is not because they do not value connection, but because dependency forces them into emotional territory that feels unpredictable and hard to manage. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious adds another layer to this understanding. Jung believed that the aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge do not disappear but instead become part of the unconscious, influencing us indirectly. For avoidance, needs, emotional reliance, and deep attachment can become part of this hidden psychological space because they conflict with the identity of being self-sufficient or emotionally independent. Over time, they may learn to suppress or disconnect from those needs rather than consciously engage with them. This creates an internal split where the desire for connection exists, but is kept out of awareness as a form of self-protection. Dependency, in this sense, is not just about relying on another person. It becomes symbolic of losing emotional autonomy. When someone becomes important to them, it can unconsciously trigger fears of being overwhelmed by feelings they are not fully comfortable processing. This is why avoidants may pull back when relationships start to deepen, not necessarily because they do not care, but because caring begins to activate a sense of emotional reliance that feels destabilizing. The more they feel they might need someone, the stronger the urge becomes to re-establish distance and regain a sense of internal control. From the outside, this can look like rejection avoidance, but internally it is often more about avoiding the intensity of their own emotional experience than avoiding the other person. Jung's idea of the unconscious helps explain why this pattern can feel so automatic. When dependency-related emotions are repeatedly pushed away, they do not vanish. They remain active beneath awareness and can surface later in indirect ways, such as delayed longing, nostalgia, or internal conflict after separation. In this way, avoidants are not free from dependency. They are often in a continuous process of managing it without fully acknowledging it. What they fear most is not simply losing someone, but encountering the version of themselves that emerges when they admit they care deeply and rely emotionally on another person. Closure can have a very different psychological effect on avoidance than most people expect, because what feels healthy and complete to one person can feel emotionally final in a way that removes all remaining attachment tension for another. When a relationship ends with clear communication, mutual understanding, and emotional resolution, it gives the mind a structured narrative to settle into. For avoidance, this structure can actually make detachment easier. It removes ambiguity, lowers emotional pressure, and allows them to mentally categorize the relationship as finished without needing to sit with unresolved feelings for too long. In that sense, closure creates a clean exit route, not just from the person, but from the emotional complexity that was present in the relationship. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious helps explain why this matters. When emotional experiences are fully processed and consciously integrated, they lose their unconscious charge. They become part of memory rather than something that continues to press for attention beneath awareness. So when avoidants receive clarity and emotional resolution, the unconscious has less material left to work with. The emotional system can close the loop, even if some feelings remain unexpressed. However, when a relationship ends abruptly, without explanation, emotional resolution, or a sense of completion, the psychological process is very different. Instead of integration, there is fragmentation. The mind is left with unanswered questions, unfinished emotional interactions, and no clear internal story to anchor the experience. For avoidants, who already tend to suppress or delay emotional processing, this lack of closure can create lingering cognitive tension. The mind does not fully file away the experience because it has no satisfying conclusion to attach to it. This is where unresolved psychological tension becomes important. The absence of closure keeps the emotional system slightly activated in the background, even if it is not consciously recognized. Thoughts may resurface unexpectedly, memories may feel sharper than anticipated, and curiosity about the other person's life can remain longer than usual. This is not necessarily intense longing in a direct sense, but more of a persistent mental loop created by incomplete emotional processing. Jung would describe this as the psyche attempting to restore balance by revisiting unresolved material stored in the unconscious. Because avoidants often manage emotions through distance rather than direct processing, they may be especially sensitive to this type of unresolved ending. A clean breakup allows emotional disengagement to happen smoothly, but a sudden or brutal cutoff leaves no structured pathway for detachment to fully complete. As a result, the connection can linger in the background of the mind in a way that feels unfinished. Over time, this can sometimes lead to delayed reflection, nostalgia, or attempts to reconnect. Not always because the attachment is strong in the present moment, but because the psychological narrative was never fully closed. The idea that the harder you move on, the more they feel it is less about dramatic emotional reactions and more about how absence reshapes psychological perception over time. In the early stages after separation, avoidants may not appear affected at all. In fact, they might seem calm or even relieved because the immediate pressure of emotional closeness is gone. But what often gets overlooked is that this initial response is about regulation, not resolution. Once the emotional intensity of the relationship fades, the mind gradually begins to process what is no longer available. And what becomes noticeable over time is not just the loss of a person, but the loss of access. Access to your attention, your emotional presence, your responsiveness, and the subtle sense of connection that was once part of their daily emotional environment. Carl Jung's perspective on the unconscious helps explain why this shift matters. When something is consistently present in our emotional field, we often underestimate its significance because the mind adapts to familiarity. But once it is removed completely, its psychological weight becomes clearer. For avoidants who tend to manage closeness through emotional distancing, this realization is often delayed because they are not fully processing attachment in real time. Instead, they rely on detachment as a way to reduce emotional intensity while still remaining loosely connected. When you begin to move on in a genuine and sustained way, something important changes in that dynamic. Your emotional availability, even if previously taken for granted, is no longer accessible. This creates a form of psychological contrast. The mind starts to register the difference between presence and absence more clearly because there is no longer an expectation of return or availability. And in that contrast, the emotional significance of what was lost can become more visible. Jung would describe this as unconscious material, rising into awareness when external distractions are removed. The absence of interaction removes the usual emotional feedback loop, forcing the mind to sit with what remains unresolved internally. For avoidants, this can be particularly uncomfortable because they are more accustomed to processing emotions indirectly rather than directly confronting them. As a result, your detachment does not immediately create emotional reaction, but it can create delayed reflection.